Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tonellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Susan Midalia is an award-winning Perth-based novelist, freelance editor and former academic who has published 3 collections of short stories and 2 novels. Her first novel, The Art of Persuasion, was published in 2018, and this month her brand new novel, Everyday Madness, was released by Fremantle Press. A poignant, hopeful story about marriage, family and new beginnings. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Bernard, Gloria, Meg and Ella and found myself not wanting their story to end just yet. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to chat a little more about them with their creator this morning. Hi and welcome to the podcast, Susan.
Thank you, Claudine. It's lovely to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. Congratulations on this wonderful novel. Are you happy with the reception it's been getting?
To date, yes. It has been reviewed about 5 or 6 times, and to be honest, just to be reviewed in itself is wonderful, because I think the worst thing that can happen to a writer is that their book goes out into the world and then it dies. No one takes any notice. So I'm very happy with the reviews I've had, and I have had a few promotional events as well. So yes, all going well.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of our chat, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the story.
The story began with a short story that I'd written in my 3rd collection, Feet to the Stars. And there's a very unpleasant character in it. The story is called Working It Out, and he's a cynical, arrogant, rather self-satisfied man who treats his wife with contempt. And for some reason, this character kept nudging me to give him a second chance, as it were. And that's never happened to me before. I've never been tempted to take one of my short stories and develop them into a novel. But this is how it started. And I did find myself thinking, is it possible Bernard, the character, is 59 years old. Is it possible for him to become a better person, as it were? And then the story just evolved. And I should say this, that I'm not a planner. I don't sketch out a plot. I don't really have any sense of where the book might be going. I just make a start and see where it takes me, and it often takes me to very surprising places. One of the things I love most about writing fiction is this encounter with the unexpected. I know there are writers who plan meticulously, but I can't work in that way. So it became a story about Bernard's very unhappy marriage, and then it encompassed other family members. So his former daughter-in-law, Meg, and their grandchild, Ella. And they're all estranged from each other, apart from the mother and daughter. And I wanted to write a book in different voices. So I have the 4 different voices of those characters. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoy pretending to be someone who isn't me. I don't know whether you've ever had the experience of waking up in the morning and realising it's your boring old self again. It would be much more interesting to be someone else. I like creating different perspectives, different voices, imagining what the world might be like if you're a middle-aged man like Bernard who loses his job, if you're his wife Gloria who becomes clinically depressed, Meg who's an overprotective mother. I was never an overprotective mother, but then I had 2 sons. It might have been different if I'd had a daughter, as Meg does. And Ella, who's 12 years old, nearly 12, it's obviously a long time since I've been 12, so I had to work particularly hard at that one, getting the voice sounding plausible and convincing. So I got quite a lot of feedback on that voice. She was the one who gave me the toughest time. But I like having children in books. Kids can be a lot of fun, and they can be very astute observers of the world, I think. And often often kind of alert to the wonder of the world in a way that adults sometimes lose. We get a bit dulled by habit. So that's my book, basically. It's about how people can change, the power of forgiveness. Yeah, that's it, I guess.
I wanted to say that all 4 of these point of view characters are flawed, but Bernard, I felt, was the least redeeming, at least until the last quarter of the novel, I would say. So I wanted to ask you, were you concerned that he was too unlikable?
Well, I have had this debate with people, and I must say that I do understand how readers can be put off by an unlikable character. But on the other hand, I'm a little disconcerted by this current trend, if you like, to have relatable characters. I want a character I can relate to. And I think unpleasant characters can be really interesting in a book. They can drive the narrative. They can pique the reader's curiosity. Why is he like this? What's made him become this sort of man? I take the point that too much of him can really put readers off. And so I've deliberately had the second section. The novel begins with Bernard, and he's cynical and arrogant and rather self-pitying, but he does have some redeeming features. I've tried to tease them out in the opening section. But then the second section, I made a deliberate switch to his granddaughter, Ella, who's smart and funny. She's not precocious. I didn't want her to be precocious, but that's kind of lightened the mood, as it were. I didn't want to hit the reader with too much bleakness.
Yeah, I only asked you that question because I have written a manuscript, my previous manuscript to the one that I'm working on now. And I think the biggest criticism that I had that I had received in relation to that manuscript was that the protagonist was unlikable, at least for about half of the book. And I just find it really interesting, when you do encounter a character who's, a little bit, as you say, unrelatable, that whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I was interested to hear your point of view.
Well, if I were the publisher or publishers to whom you sent that, that's not what I would say. That would not be my response. I don't feel that having an unpleasant character is necessarily a bad thing. And if we're always going to be reading about people who are like us, who are, pleasant, I mean, that's kind of boring. And it's a diminishment of your imaginative capacities. If you have a really unpleasant character, I would be thinking questions like, what has made him like this? What's his backstory? The world of reading would be a very dull place if we were only allowed to have relatable or pleasant characters. Christos Tsiolkos's The Slap.
Yeah.
That's a different story because all the characters are horrible.
Indeed.
There's not one character who isn't deeply flawed. And I found that difficult to take. There's a wonderful quote by the novelist C.S. Lewis who says, "We read to know that we are not alone."
Indeed.
And I really like that. But on the other hand, if that's all we read, if we want a book to reflect who we are and what our experiences are, I think that's quite diminishing. It can lead to a narrowing of your own capacities, if you like. Why would you want to go on reading about people who are just like you? So it seems that would be boring, I think.
Yeah, so fascinating. You talked about putting yourself in the shoes of another person. As the only male point of view character in this book, did you find it challenging to write from Bernard's perspective?
No, not particularly. Some of the unlikable qualities that he has, I'm prone to myself. But also I know many people like Bernard, and this is what writers do. We pay attention to the world we read. We're always getting our ideas from the outside world. So to write about an adult male, I didn't find particularly challenging, no. And, I haven't been through a messy divorce as Meg has, but people often ask, where do you get your ideas from? And the answer to that is everywhere. You get it from your reading, from observing people, listening to people, from going for a walk. You know, if you go for a walk, you can find 10 things to write about. I must say the one perspective I wouldn't presume to write about. I mean, in my short stories, for example, I've written about working class people, and, you know, I'm a highly educated person. I've written about migrants, written about teenagers, but the one perspective I wouldn't presume to write about is an Indigenous perspective, because I feel that would be presumptuous. I would write about them, but I wouldn't write from the perspective of an Indigenous person. I simply don't know enough, and I think it's up to them to, you know, it's their right to write from their perspective, not mine.
Now, this was a book that explored what you refer to as everyday madness, a term which you've used to explore common psychological conditions suffered by what you refer to as otherwise rational people, things like depression, anxiety, being overly suspicious of other people, etc. And you've also used it to describe everyday obsessions that people seem to have. So I wanted to ask you, tell me, why was it important to you to explore these things in your novel?
I'm just fascinated by the way in which, you know, so-called rational people can become quite irrational under the pressure of personal and social circumstances. And it happens to so many people, really. It's a not uncommon phenomenon, but that doesn't make it any the less interesting. So it does fascinate me. Gloria, who suffers from clinical depression, is a different story. And I wouldn't call that, you know, kind of madness in any derogatory sense. I didn't want that to be the case. But what interests me about depression, and clinical depression in particular, is it has, the diagnosis of it and people presenting with it has become more common. And I can't remember the stat now, but it's a substantial number of people in Australia who are now on prescribed antidepressants. I guess one of the things I wanted to do in the novel was to destigmatize it, for one thing, but also to kind of dispel the common misconception that depression is just a kind of state of the blues. You know, it's nothing really major. And so I have shown some pretty awful symptoms in Gloria's case, you know, hallucinations and the inability to eat and so on. So this is no minor just feeling a bit blue today, feeling a bit down. So that particular aspect of falling into the irrational, if you like, I wanted to make Gloria's lived experience of depression really vivid, you know, so that people could understand this is a serious problem. It's not something to be dismissed lightly, as Gloria's doctor, the GP, does at the beginning, just tells her she's depressed, whips out a notebook and writes her a prescription. Yeah, just the idea that intelligent and rational people can become a little crazy. There's a wonderful quote by 18th century writer Jonathan Swift. He says, "Man is not a man," because he's writing in the 18th century, he's unreconstructed male. "Man is not a rational animal, but a creature capable of reason."
I wanted to ask you about the title. Was this your title or the publisher's?
Oh, gosh, you know what? I can't remember. I do remember, I'm not very good at titles, and I do remember when I first submitted it to Fremantle, I had something really kind of bland, something like, I don't know, Four Voices, something that really didn't give you any sense of what the book was about. And my wonderful editor, Georgia Richter, said, you know, you need a title that's going to give the readers a kind of lead in or a lens to start reading the book. And yes, it was me. Now, I did come up with the title, but it took a lot of work.
Yeah.
That was a really hard, you know, I like one-word titles myself.
It always fascinates me because I find that distilling the essence of your novel into, you know, a few words is very, very difficult. And it's essentially what you're trying to do with a title. And that is just so perfect that I just wondered at your brilliance, I guess, in coming up with that.
As I say, it was a bit of a fluke. I really had to sit down and think, well, you know, what do these four people have in common? Because even Ella, in her desire to impress a friend, an apparently much more sophisticated friend or a sophisticated person than Ella is. In her desire to impress her, she then starts behaving inappropriately.
Yeah.
Eventually. So we all do it. But I really had to think about what connects these four characters other than something bland like, four voices or family troubles or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think I just hit on it.
Now, I must say, of all the characters in this book, I identified with Meg the most. I'm not a single parent, but I could identify with her all-consuming desire to protect her daughter, her overprotectiveness, and that feeling of being pressured by other parents, other kids, and society in general to give over to teenage demands, despite your instincts telling you otherwise. Now, I thought that Meg handled things so much better than I would have in the same situation. But do you think that she felt as if she was swimming against the tide a lot of the time, that she knew that people thought she was too extreme?
Yeah, and I do have a section in the novel that explicitly deals with that issue. I mean, it's there implicitly all the way along, but there is a section where I have Meg thinking, she knew that other mothers found her anxious and she was trying hard not to be over anxious, but balanced against that is her recognition, and it's a very real one, that about the kind of inappropriate sexualization of young girls. So the way girls of 9, 10 can dress very sexily because that's what their culture tells them they should do, but without any understanding really of what the consequences for that might be. So there's this real mismatch between a fundamental naivete of little girls and this sexualization. We live in a kind of hypersexualized culture, and little girls more and more are being asked to be sexually attractive, not to be innocent. So I understand. I wanted to create a character in Meg who was working against the tide of contemporary pressures, including her refusal to give her daughter a mobile phone.
Which I wholeheartedly supported, by the way.
Oh, good. That's a tricky one because, kids as young as 3 and 4 have a mobile phone. Now, no one thinks well, it's become normalized. And so Meg is fighting against the tide, but it's very hard when you're nearly 12 and all your friends have a mobile phone. But at the same time, I wanted Ella to be at some level quite innocent. She's not boy crazy. She's not particularly interested in boys. She has 2 really good female friends that she's had since kindergarten. And she likes playing Scrabble. I didn't want her to be nerdy and I didn't want her to be precocious, but I didn't want her to be, a ditzy pre-adolescent who was gaga over boys and wanted the latest in fashions and so on. I wanted to retain some kind of innocence, and I guess that's partly attributable to her mother.
Absolutely.
So I like that idea. But as I said, if I'd had daughters, I probably would have been much more anxious than I was about having 2 boys. Even just something like letting them go on public transport on their own. My boys did that at a pretty early age, but I don't know if I would have done that if I'd had a daughter. Probably not. It's interesting in the current climate, particularly about the heightened awareness of sexual harassment and rape and so on, that the emphasis is still on girls having to monitor their behavior rather than looking at the men and saying, you've got to change how you think about how you treat them.
So, Susan, I wanted to say that to a large extent, I felt that this novel was about second chances. Will there be a second chance for Gloria and Bernard despite the estrangement that had developed between them for so long? Will Meg give Gloria and Bernard a second chance to be grandparents to Ella despite her divorce from their son Carl? And will Meg give Hal the chance to prove the kind of man he really is? So I wanted to ask you, was this specifically something you wanted to explore, and why?
In the beginning, not consciously, just something that emerged with Bernard and Gloria, that the whole idea of second chances, I think both of them are kind of jolted into a new way of thinking. And with Bernard, when he loses his job and he kind of falls into abjection, depression, lack of self-worth, feeling adrift, I think he begins to understand what Gloria might be feeling. Even something as simple as he gets insomniac, and for someone who's never had that problem to suddenly be lying awake, thrashing out all sorts of things, he begins to understand how Gloria might have felt when she lay awake for days on end, nights on end. But with Gloria, the big change, I think, comes when she's told by a psychiatrist that the way Bernard has been treating her is abuse. It's emotional and psychological abuse. And she's never had a name for it. When she gets the name and realizes what's happening, and with the help of antidepressant medication, she begins to have more self-respect. And I think that's really important if you are the victim of abuse, to be able to stand up for yourself. But having said that, it's a really tricky situation. If a woman's in a violent relationship, and Bernard is not violent, but if she's in a very violent or threatening relationship, to then stand up for herself can have terrible consequences.
Yes.
So, I'm mindful of that. It's not that easy, but some level of self-respect, I think, some level of, you have no right to do this to me. That's part of what begins the change in their relationship. And then her insistence on talking, her insistence on him listening. And again, I'm not sort of starry-eyed about this. This is a difficult process, especially when you're nearing 60 and you've never had these kinds of conversations before. And so one of the things I've done at the end is to suggest, well, people change, but with Meg and her former mother-in-law, Gloria, like Bernard, Meg's always been rather contemptuous of Gloria because she's unschooled. She appears to be quite vacuous and inane, talks incessantly. But what Meg comes to see, I think, comes to appreciate is Gloria's kindness and her thoughtfulness. And these are the things that matter. So one of the things I was exploring in that relationship was the classic conflict between head and heart. Which do we value more? Do we value intelligence, articulateness, or do we value someone who's kind, compassionate, even when they irritate the hell out of you? So there's a wonderful scene in Jane Austen's Emma where Emma is rude to the garrulous spinster, Miss Bates. She humiliates her in public without realising that she's doing it. It's thoughtless. And then she gets the big lecture from Mr. Knightley. He says, "Badly done, Emma. That's badly done indeed." And that's a moment it's a really interesting moment, I think, that idea that if you are an intelligent person, then part of intelligence means not using that intelligence to belittle other people, which is precisely what she did. So I'm interested in that idea of looking beyond the surface of people's behaviour and thinking about their character. What are their values? Are they fundamentally good people, even if they talk all the time like me? So...
No, I found that really fascinating. And I think, kindness is the underlying theme in all of that, and treating people with kindness. And I thought that was beautiful. So I wanted to ask you, Susan, what would you like readers to take away from this novel?
Oh, I'd like them to enjoy it. That sounds a bit lame, but for me, a book has to be enjoyable. By enjoyable, I don't mean pleasant. I wanted people to engage with it, to be interested in the characters and the issues I was exploring through those characters. I wanted a combination of, encouraging reflection, but also making people laugh. I like humour in stories myself when I read them. And I wanted readers to feel a sense of hope that change is possible. And I wanted readers to think about the quality of the writing. For me, whatever a novel is about, it has to be two things. And one is that it has to be interesting, and two, it has to be well written. So at that level of writing, I want readers to be able to think, well, yes, it was a good read, partly because it was well written. I put a lot of effort into my use of language, the structure. I'm not saying it's a perfect novel. It certainly isn't. I know it's got flaws, but I want the reading of it to feel effortless. I don't want readers to think that it's laboured or too obvious. That's the hard part of writing, getting the language right, getting the structure right. It's the part I most enjoy, the self-editing part. It's never perfect. When I submitted it to Fremantle Press, I thought, oh, I've just written the great Australian novel. It's brilliant. And then the editor said, well, no, think about this, think about that. I think I'm a much better editor of other people's work than I am of my own, because you're too close to the book. And especially if you've lived with it for a long time, if you've spent 2 or 3 years writing it, you get to the point where you can't really see it anymore.
I completely agree with that. Susan, you retired from teaching in 2007 to become a full-time writer. You did a PhD in contemporary women's fiction, and you've been published in a number of publications. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think contemporary women's fiction has changed over the years in Australia, and what do you think it says about our literary landscape?
How do I think it's changed? That's a big question. There was a big boom in the 60s and 70s of feminist novels, and my PhD was on contemporary Australian women's fiction, and I looked at 4 novels that came out of the 70s and 80s, and there was a big push on, and it was a really important moment, I think, in publishing history, where women were finding their voices being published, and it was about female experience. And what's happened since then? I think it's become perhaps more overtly sexualized. I think that's important too, to show that women can be sexually desiring subjects rather than merely objects. It's become perhaps more experimental, more nuanced in some ways in terms of sexual relationships. The kind of feminist novels that came out of the 60s, 70s, even 80s, tended, as feminism did at the time, tended to use the binary model of oppressor victim. And so in some ways, I think the fiction's now recognizing that women can be self-victimizers too. Not that excuses toxic masculinity, not at all. But I have, in my novel, I have a section where Meg is telling her daughter about this, and it might sound trivial, but it is kind of symptomatic, I think, of the way women often think about themselves. Women know rationally, or most of us do, in our heads, that your appearance has nothing to do with your worth as a human being. But every day women are bombarded with images of impossibly beautiful women. And there are probably very few women in contemporary Western society anyway who aren't dissatisfied at some level with the way they look. And so even though rationally we know it's a load of rubbish, we still have this kind of 2 centimetres in our brain, which tells us, we're not this enough, we're not skinny enough, we're not, our skin's too wrinkled or whatever. That kind of tyranny of appearances is very hard for a lot of women to overcome.
Do you think women have a lot more agency in fiction these days?
I think perhaps the big thing that's changed in contemporary fiction is the intersection of gender with race and class and culture, so that the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s was a white middle class movement. And as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of schisms in feminism then about, from women of colour, for example, or working class women saying, well, hang on, you don't represent me, or you don't understand my experiences. So I think we're getting a lot more now of books about women, but where it's not just the gender that matters, but the gender and intersection with race or with class. I think that's been a really important shift.
Susan, there are many writers who listen to this podcast, and given your experience in teaching, editing and publishing, I was wondering if you had any tips to offer aspiring writers looking to get their manuscript published, or about the writing process generally.
So the writing process, and I know this is said so often by so many writers, but it is absolutely vital, and that's, if you're serious about your writing, you have to be a reader. You have to read widely, critically. Often you just learn so much from reading good writers. You learn all sorts of tricks. You know, part of what writing is learning strategies, but you learn about the different possibilities of language and story. So that would be my first piece of advice, just read. To give you just one example, I didn't know, when I was writing short stories, I didn't know that you could have a coda to a story that happened 30 years after the main event. And that was an Alice Munro story called, appropriately enough, Tricks. Wonderful story. And so, you know, you learn about different ways to shape a story. You learn a whole bunch of new words, she said inarticulately. So yes, reading. I think not to be precious about your writing, certainly not to wait for that so-called flash of inspiration. You just sit down and write, on the understanding that your first draft is probably going to be terrible, and you work at it. The other tip I would have, I find this really useful, is I read my work aloud, because you can hear things that you don't see on the screen or on a piece of paper. So you can hear inadvertent repetitions, for example. You can hear whether the rhythm is achieving the effect you're after. You can hear the pace of a story even, or the pace of a chapter. You know, is there a bit that feels laboured, or is there too an abrupt a transition from one thing to another? You know, so you can hear all that when you read it out loud. You can hear whether the tone is what you wanted. The other thing I'd say is never compare yourself with other writers. I mean, read lots, but don't. I mean, I know sometimes you can read something that's so brilliant you think, why do I bother? It can be quite demoralising. There are thousands and thousands, millions of people out there who are better writers than I am, but that doesn't stop me from writing. You know, if you think you have something worthwhile saying, and because it's just such a pleasurable thing to do, show your work to a couple of trusted readers. Some people get a lot out of workshopping their manuscripts or their stories to a group. I've never found that particularly useful, because you tend to get conflicting opinions. But I've always shown my work to a couple of people, not always the same people, depending on what I've written, but people who, you know, who are good critics, who will give you constructive criticism. There's no point showing it to someone if they're just going to gush and tell you how wonderful it is. In terms of productivity, a lot of writers will tell you that if you can get 500 words a day that you're pleased with, that's an excellent result. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you can manage 500 words a day, you've got 3,000 words at the end of the week. In terms of submitting a manuscript for publication, and I know I've done this myself, don't send it off as soon as you've finished it, because particularly when you've written a novel and it's taken you, you know, years even, there's that elation that comes with finishing, just the sheer relief as well. And you think, right, it's ready to go. I want to get it out of my life. But you really need to let your writing sit. And by that, I mean, you know, a month. Let it sit for a month. Come back and read it with a much more distant, cold eye, and you'll see flaws, you'll see things that are wrong with it. So it's really important to not to rush it, to show your work to a couple of other people, and just be patient, I guess, to get your manuscript in the best possible shape it can be before you send it off. This is really important. Have a look at the lists of things that publishers typically publish. You know, there's no point, even say with just a short story, there's no point in, if it's a conventional beginning, middle and end story, there's no point sending it to a journal that favours experimental fiction. So you've got to have a look at what the editorial preferences are, if you like. If you're a short story writer, there are lots of competitions you can enter. And I think that's, just go for it. That's how I got started. I entered a short story competition and it won, and I was so elated is the word. I think, I can, someone's telling me I can do this. So that can be enormously encouraging. Apply for grants. There's money out there. There are competitions out there. And I guess not to be disheartened. No one likes rejections. I've had rejections. I have no doubt I'll continue to get them. And after you sob for a couple of days, you just have to toughen up and say, well, that's one person's opinion. And keep trying. I have a friend who's recently published a fabulous debut novel. She had about 5 rejections. And it's before she got a publisher accepted, and it's partly about finding someone, a reader who will like what you do. It's sometimes just a matter of taste,
Yeah.
Or it's partly a matter of what they've currently got on their list at that time. Your novel might be too similar to a couple of other things they're publishing. These are all things that are out of your control. So you just have to keep trying. James Joyce had 29 rejections for Ulysses.
Goodness.
So when I tried to teach it, I thought, God, I wish that 30th publisher had turned it. I mean, it's a fabulous book. But the first time I actually read it all the way through was when I had to teach it. And it's hard work. I mean, there's some fabulous sections, but there are others where I was completely out of my depth.
Susan, Everyday Madness was a delightful, hopeful novel that I truly, truly enjoyed reading. I wish you every success with it. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you so much, Claudine. It's been a lovely conversation. Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.